Hi, folks. My name is Woody Turner. I'm the program manager at NASA headquarters, managing the biological diversity and ecological forecasting programs. Very happy to be here today and want to thank you all first for coming. Welcome you to this session that's going to talk about GEO's Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, or MarineBON, which is a leading element of the GeoBON, which is the Geo Biodiversity Observation Network. In fact, it's the marine component, really, of GeoBON. We want to talk today about how, in particular, MarineBON is working to support the Sustainable Development Goal number 14. That's life below water. Earlier this year, in fact, it was only about 8-9 months ago, NASA received a proposal from Dr. Franklin McCarter, sitting right over here from the University of South Florida, that sought to add a component to his existing MarineBON project, which is focused on providing information about biological diversity to the national marine sanctuaries, Florida Keys, Florida Garden Banks, and Monterey Bay to help them in their sanctuary reporting. And so he's asked if he could add on to that work, that important work, with an additional effort that would focus on this SDG 14, life below water. So we want to talk about that today, and also, but really more broadly than that, want to go into a discussion of how we're combining not only MBON, but in other efforts as well. Combining in situ biological data, so basic biodiversity data sets, with satellite remote sensing of environmental parameters and ecological models to come up with an understanding of how life in the seas is changing, and how we can address SDG 14's charge, which is to conserve and sustainably use our ocean, seas, and marine resources. Okay, first, we're really, though, fortunate to have Dr. Nancy Knowlton here. Dr. Knowlton is the Sant Chair of Marine Science at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. She's going to talk to us about the importance of biodiversity tools for marine biodiversity Earth observing from in situ to satellite. Okay. Now, many of you guys have no doubt read or at least seen the incredible imagery from Dr. Knowlton's book, Citizens of the Sea. It's just glorious. That captures a lot of the creatures that were documented by the Census of Marine Life, the 10-year effort that preceded MarineBON. And in many ways, MarineBON, which we're talking about today, is a child of that census. Frankly, it was a group of agencies, which I was participating, Gabrielle Canonico as well here from NOAA, Jim Price from BOEM, and a number of other agencies in an interagency format, talking about how we were going to follow up the census, and that led to the document that started us off on the MarineBON. So I'm really glad to have you here, Dr. Knowlton. Thank you very much. After Dr. Knowlton, Gabrielle Canonico from NOAA is going to get up and talk about the MarineBON demonstration projects, give us a quick overview of MarineBON, who, what, when, where, why. NASA's really pleased to be a part of this, along with BOEM and NOAA and the Smithsonian. And thanks to GeoBON, I think MarineBON is on the verge of going from essentially a domestically focused activity to an internationally focused activity through the efforts of Dr. Miller Carter's project. Enrique Montes is here. His efforts, a new project just getting started that will extend this MarineBON from U.S. waters throughout the Western Hemisphere in a pole-to-pole effort. So we're really excited about that. And then after Gabrielle, Ben Best from EcoQuants is going to get up and talk about SDG-relevant products that are coming out of this activity that's only been going on for 8-9 months or so. And then we'll have a panel of experts. Steve Giddings is here from the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. Duke University's Pat Halpin is also in the room. And then Michael Ott from the International Oceanographic Commission, IOC, are going to talk about how we can domestically and internationally promulgate MarineBON and those activities to support the sustainability of our ocean life. And we've asked them to address 3 questions. I'll just read these out to you in this panel. 3 issues, I should say. 1 is the value of observing marine biodiversity. 2nd, advancing ocean observing through the integration of marine biological observations with physical and biogeochemical observations, which is really the state of the art now, and something that MarineBON is working hard to achieve. And then 3rd, the future of MarineBON, looking at tools, global assessments of life in the sea, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, where we go from here. So with that, I'll step back and ask Dr. Knowlton to come up and talk to us. Thank you.
Thanks. So I sort of view my role here as kind of setting the stage for the more detailed looking at what MBON is doing and what could do. So what I'd like to do is start with just a little bit about marine biodiversity itself, and with the obvious point that it's really hard to measure, and that's why marine biodiversity has been essentially absent from all of these geo efforts, is because it's so difficult. The ocean represents, as you all know, 70% of the surface, 95% of the habitable real estate, and of course it's because of all that water that we know so little even about the physical dimensions of the planet ocean, much less the biological one. So here you see the resolution that we have for mapping the seafloor, which is 100% at 5 kilometers, whereas for the Moon, Venus, and Mars, it's 100 or nearly 100% at 100 meters. Give you a sense of what the sort of scale of ignorance, even the physics, is for the ocean. And of course, when it comes to life in the ocean, we know even less. And this is actually a picture by a National Geographic photographer of everything that was recorded within 1 cubic foot, because it was a art project rather than a science project in Monterey. And it illustrates, I think, really clearly some of the additional characteristics, in addition to the scale of the sheer size of the problem, which makes understanding marine biodiversity so hard, namely that many of the organisms are small. It's also true that many of them are rare. And it's been estimated that somewhere between 30% and 90% have never even been named. And so it's perhaps not too surprising that even for the really big stuff, we're uncertain about something as basic as the number of species. We don't really have agreement on the number of species of orca or the number of species of coelacanth. These are charismatic megafauna. You'd think we'd have even something that basic straight, and yet we don't. And so it's perhaps even less surprising that for the small stuff, we don't even really know what we don't know. And a case in point, of course, is Prochlorococcus marinus. It's 60% of ocean's chlorophyll, 100,000 cells per millimeter, super abundant organism. It was discovered in 1988. It's pretty staggering. And so most recently, I just thought I'd share this with you as a species of fish described by Luis Rocha, named in honor of one of the proponents of the unknown unknowns, namely Donald Rumsfeld. So, and of course, then when you look at the MBON goals themselves, this is what I've circled as what I've just been talking about, is marine species biodiversity, and there's all this other stuff that you're doing as well. So it gives you a sense of how little we know about that one tiny section of all those circles that you're trying to deal with. And so, as in the introduction, it was mentioned that a lot of what you all will be talking about this afternoon stems from the census. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the part of the census I was most involved with, which was the census of coral reefs. Now, the census for reefs didn't even start till 2005. That is halfway through the entire census project. So we had 5 years to so-called census coral reefs. And given that somewhere between a quarter and a third of everything that lives in the ocean lives associated with coral reefs, we clearly weren't going to really census the coral reefs of the planet. And so what we decided to do is instead focus on the methods that could be used in the future to census reefs, rather than trying to make some kind of half-hearted effort to census the reefs themselves. And so our principal guiding ways that we wanted to do this was to combine automation, that is at least, maybe not automation, but at least ease of measurement, with standardization so that measurements could be compared around the planet, and that would lead to scalability. And of course, I'm not going to talk at all about satellites, actually, because I'm not an expert in satellites, but it's clear that satellites epitomize this issue of this goal of automation and standardization. That's why we know a lot about how much chlorophyll there is in the ocean. But unfortunately, once you get below the surface of the ocean, we have a lot fewer tools that we can draw on. And so what we tried to do was use DNA methods, and these I know are being picked up in the eDNA context for some of the MBON projects. So DNA isn't an automated form of identifying biodiversity, but it cuts out a lot of the time, and now is actually much, much less expensive than doing it by traditional methods. And then we use standardized sampling to get to that standardized component. And so we started off because we were working on reefs with just standardized volumes of habitat. This is really similar to standardized plankton toes or standardized sediment core, but for the benthic community, we didn't really have something that was comparable to plankton toes or soft sediment cores, and so we just took standardized volumes of natural habitat, namely reef rubble. But eventually we decided to go for a standardized structure that we could put down not only on coral reefs but in other places as well. And that's what you see down below, so-called autonomous reef monitoring structures, but they don't have to be on coral reefs. They can really be anywhere. And they're like underwater condominiums. You put them underwater, you leave them there for 1 to 3 years and see who moves in. So here you see them deployed on the reefs of Saudi Arabia, but also being carried down to a submersible to about 700 feet off the deep reefs of Curacao. And the map on the bottom shows you some of the places that we've put them. This map is actually out of date at this point. We have them everywhere from Arctic Canada to Antarctica, the Red Sea, throughout the Pacific and the Atlantic. So what do you get when you use these kinds of structures? Essentially, you wind up with a whole bunch of different kinds of organisms, which you can divide into different fractions. You can have the things that are larger than 2 millimeters, which for DNA purposes, we just use traditional barcoding. But all the small stuff and all the sessile stuff that's glued to the plates, you basically just throw it in a blender, I hate to say it, and do what's called meta-barcoding, again using the CO1 mitochondrial gene, but that gives you a list of all the different organisms that are in those different samples. And so in terms of what you find on these things, they're remarkably good ways of characterizing and capturing diversity in a region. So these are what I would call the charismatic microfauna, things greater than 2 millimeters, but a lot smaller than a coelacanth. This is the smaller fraction, one of the two smaller fractions, 2 millimeters to 500 microns. These are less charismatic, but are really diverse, as you'll see. And this is what the sessile fractions look like from a number of different places, Indonesia across the top, and then Virginia, Florida, and Panama on the bottom. So the Indonesia plates give you a sense of the amazing diversity and how difficult it would be to capture that in any other way than the way we are doing it. And then the plates across the bottom give you a really nice sense of a latitudinal gradient of species diversity from temperate Virginia, which is basically a monoculture, to Panama, lower productivity, but a lot of different species. So we've used these in a number of different ways, including off the reefs of Papua New Guinea, where carbon dioxide bubbles up from the seafloor, gives you a picture of what the oceans might look like under various scenarios of ocean acidification. So here you see them in situ with the carbon dioxide bubbling up. And on the right, you see two reefs from these study areas, one with normal pH at 8.1, and the much, much lower diversity of the coral, the corals themselves in a lower pH. So when you look at what you get from these samples, here you see the results that we have. And the pattern is actually quite interesting, which is that the largest organisms, as I mentioned, are much less diverse. It's a tiny fraction of the diversity are the things that we normally study in biodiversity surveys, the bigger things, really tiny fraction of the diversity relative to all the small stuff. But they are also the things that are most hard hit by ocean acidification. So what you wind up with is a loss. In this case, what you see is a loss in diversity by about 50% of everything that's bigger than 2 millimeters, and you get a similar loss in abundance of about 50%. So I'd like to talk now about a couple of other projects that sort of take advantage of this concept of scalability and automation. And one is Marine Geo, which is a derivative of the Forest Geo program, which I'm pretty sure must be represented outside somewhere for the Smithsonian. So this was a later, Forest Geo predated Marine Geo. In fact, Forest Geo works on the premise of characterizing forests by measuring every tree greater than 5 centimeters diameter breast height. And so again, it has this sort of very simple measurement, allows for automation and scalability. And so the idea was to do the same thing for Marine Geo, which is a network for standardized sampling and also standardized experiments, because you don't just have to standardize the sampling itself. And on this map, you see some of the sites that are part of the Marine Geo Network, which and Marine Geo is really part of MBON, even though it's not a pilot project. We consider ourselves part of the MBON family. And here you see an example of what one kind of standardization can achieve. This is called the Ocean Bite Map. It's made by putting out small sticks with little bits of dried squid on them and measuring how much squid is left after 1 hour, and after 24 hours you can see the fish in the video eating the squid. And on the right hand side you see the relationship between temperature and predation intensity. And so this allows you to get a global measure of predation by distributing this kind of very simple experiment. And I would like to mention here and then in the following example as well. This is an area where you don't necessarily always need really high-tech things to get to be standardized. Obviously the meta barcoding is fairly high-tech, but this is a classic example of citizen science where you've got a pretty low-tech method, but it gives you a measure of predation. And then another example of the power of citizen science, a different way of getting scalability, which is the Reef Life Survey of greater than 4,000 surveys of fish and bottom communities around the world. You can see where the survey has taken place on the left, and on the right, or on the next slide rather, you can see some of the data. This shows that basically in low diversity sites, there's much more of a variation for fish biomass than in high diversity sites as a function of temperature. And so it gives you a sense of how diversity buffers the volatility to climate change, which is a really important point to make when you're trying to argue about why it's important to protect biodiversity. I'd like to conclude with one last part of what I think is really important about the MBON project, and that is the importance of telling the story, going back to that set of goals for MBON. One of them is stakeholders, communication, and management. And when I was thinking about this talk, I mean, I'm not, you know, I really did want to read about MBON in detail and think about and watch a number of videos. And so I found the video by Kathy Sullivan, the former NOAA director, who was speaking at IUCN and about the Global Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, or MBON. And at the very end, what you see on the top image is a woman who asked a question from the audience. And that woman said, "This is great." Kathy gave it a fabulous presentation of what MBON was all about. It was really eloquent. She did it in front of one of those NASA hyperwalls of all these images. It was fabulous. At the end, however, this woman, who's got the microphone in this picture, said, "This is really nice, but I really don't think people give a damn." And Kathy's response was really interesting. She said, "We need to do a better job of telling the story of what we do. You don't tell the story through graphs. You tell the story through personal engagement, sort of putting it in the context of the people who are using these data." And so it's something I would urge us all to think about, not just the data, not just what we can do with it in the high-tech, geeky way that we all scientists like to do, but really thinking about what the story is. And for those of you who have not read it, I've got a wonderful colleague named Randy Olson. He's got a book called Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs Story. And if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. So I think that's all I have to say. I'm happy to answer questions.
Are there questions?
Yeah, questions?
Yes. The arm that you talked about, what in its nature is autonomous?
Oh, because you put them down and leave them there for three years.
There's no autonomous, like, electronics or
No, it's in that sense, it's low tech. The analysis after the fact is somewhat high tech, although I have to say, when we started this, the next generation sequencing capabilities that we have now, thanks to the Human Genome Project, are amazing. So when we started it, we figured it was going to cost $25,000 to analyze each one of these, and we just kind of plowed ahead. Fortunately, it was much harder than we thought, so a lot of time elapsed, and by the time we're now really in the midst of analyzing these samples, it's only about $1,000 to analyze each one of them.
Do you have any instrumentation that's autonomous that just, like, is underwater and is taking pictures and cataloging or anything like that?
We don't, but in terms of the ARMS project, and there is some work on the visual and sort of not only images but also sound recording that's associated with Marine Geo. So it's not time in 15 minutes to present all the different components. So I thought I really wanted to emphasize this the importance of the standardization, because you've got all these different MBON projects that are going on, but at some point, if you really want the whole to be greater than the sum of its parts, some of those methods really need to be shared. And I think the ARMS project, the Marine Geo project, and the Reef Life Survey all illustrate the kinds of data and power that you get when you can actually share methods across projects.
As there are other questions, I'm going to ask that we use this. This event is being live streamed, so people on the watching can hear you ask questions if we use the mic. I'm sorry we didn't catch it the first time. Okay,
All right,
sorry.
great. All right, so thank you. Next up, Gabrielle Canonico from the NOAA IOS office is going to give us a marine bond overview.
I should turn this off so I'm not feedback. Okay. Oh no. I just have a few slides. I just actually only have a few minutes to speak before we move to the main events, the demo and the panel. But I did want to just set the stage a little bit from a perspective of the MBON team that's been working both in the U.S. and globally to establish this network. So MBON is really an effort recognizing that there is a lot of monitoring going on from national government-supported activities to research institutions and academic institutions that are monitoring for different research objectives and goals, really to identify those and to help build a network where those groups and those information can be integrated towards a larger picture, a larger view of status and trends of biodiversity change over time. And it's also a network that is interested in bringing that capability and that capacity to places where it may not already exist, transferring technologies such as data management, observing capabilities, that sort of thing, to areas where we would like to see greater coverage as we're looking towards building a global network. And also thinking about how to advance technologies to, Nancy used the word automate, to really automate our capabilities and our observational capabilities, from citizen science types of observations to autonomous vehicles or sensors in an ocean observing capacity. And there is an effort in the U.S. that's supported, as Woody had mentioned, by NOAA, NASA, BOEM, National Science Foundation, multiple agencies in the U.S. Interagency realm that are supporting 3 demonstration projects in the Arctic, in Santa Barbara Channel off the coast of California, and across Florida Keys and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuaries. But it's also a global effort, and so those U.S. teams are really contributing to what we're learning about development of a marine biodiversity observation network at the global scale. But it's not without large, broad partnerships that we're doing this. And so really working with the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, who we'll hear from them a little later, and through the IOC, the Global Ocean Observing System, and the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, we are all in partnership together trying to define requirements for an MBON, determine what observations are feasible for an MBON, and how to deal with the data and products that are coming out of the MBON. And I just wanted to speak a little bit about how the MBON teams globally are informing the development of essential variables that we should be measuring to best understand biodiversity change specifically, but also more broadly biology and ecosystems. This analysis of those variables that we should be observing is really based on societal drivers, requirements from international agreements that our national governments have signed, and those are derived from the pressures that we're seeing in our local communities on the resources that are so important. I'm sorry. So MBON is working in a number of places. I mentioned the 3 demonstration projects ongoing in the United States. As a GeoBond thematic node, we've tried to bring MBON from pole to pole, so the Arctic to Antarctica. And as a first step, starting in the Americas, in Latin America, with colleagues there. We've had some initial meetings where we've developed a community of shared interest in expanding MBON into the Americas. And just yesterday, NASA announced its support of a project focused on developing MBON pull-to-pull for the Americas. We're also working in partnership with another GEO project led by Roger Sayre and his colleagues at Esri, where they've had some progress in developing ecological marine units at a global scale. And now they're embarking on ecological coastal units that represent standardized, robust, and practical coastal units to integrate data on physiographic settings, climate environments, wave, tide, and river regimes, and biotic distribution. So this is another example of a partnership that MBON is really reliant on as we build the network. And then just to transition to the demonstration that you're about to see, the focus on Sustainable Development Goal 14, I want to say that the MBON activity really supports Sustainable Development Goals more broadly, not just the goal focused on life underwater or in the sea. Because we're integrating global and multidisciplinary research and observations, we're helping to visualize the data that are coming from those observations in ways that are informative for resource managers, helping to identify essential ocean variables so that we can be most efficient in an observing capacity to support biodiversity understanding, and defining relationships, so that piece about integrating across physical, biogeochemical, and biological observations that Woody mentioned is really important. And then looking too at that, we've heard whitewater to blue water, different references to that connection between upstream and downstream processes and species. Those are feedbacks that we're really interested in exploring. So that's my way of transitioning to the demonstration that Ben and Enrique are about to run for us. And hopefully that sets a little bit of context. And I can take a minute for questions if there are any.
Questions for Gabrielle on Marine Bond?
I didn't
I'll
upload
ask if
anything for you.
let's use the mic for the live streamers.
Good.
Yep.
So, Escape, I'll let you.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi there, this may be a stretch, but is there any structure in place for going from the observations that get cataloged in Marine Bond to then, setting catch limits or, policy decision making about how ocean resources are used?
Well, I don't think that that's a stretch. Certainly in the U.S., we've been working, the projects have been working very closely with National Marine Fisheries, for example, in helping to inform about, habitat impacts on stock assessments, or I should say more specifically, we've been focused on integrated ecosystem assessment, which goes beyond the stocks. But there's been a good interaction, certainly in the U.S. side, with our fisheries service.
Yeah, and the reporting work that Frank's project is doing with National Marine Sanctuaries certainly touches on directly going to management with these data. Other questions? Just want to note that this really is an interagency effort. NOAA, NASA, BOEM, NSF, Roger USGS is involved. So it's multiple agencies, and we're open to others joining us. So put that out there. Okay, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Woody. Thanks, Woody and Gabrielle, for the support for this. And this is really a large effort spun up in the very near term with drawing experience from the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network at a local scale and asking how can we extend lessons to a broader scale. I also really loved Nancy Knowlton's just emphasis on the need to appeal to our storytelling selves. That's what this is about. We're trying to tell stories with data and tease out some of that complexity. So that was a major driving theme of this work. So I'm going to tag team with Enrique, and really this is just a very large effort between a bunch of folks, largely at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute and the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and NASA and NOAA and too many to mention here. But this is a little image from an August workshop that we had, and quite a bit of activity has happened actually even since then. So excited to share with you, hot off the press. So this is a bit of a repeat, but really fundamentally asking why does it matter, why should we care about the oceans, I think is a good reminder. And we derive a lot of benefits from the oceans, from livelihoods to just oxygen to you name it, quality of life. And then fundamentally with MBON, we're focused on how is it changing, and observation is really critical for understanding how our benefits are thus changing, and understanding how we can mitigate impacts is hopefully a follow-on management implication of this observational work. So we started with really focused on the national marine sanctuaries, in the case of this project, of Florida Keys and Monterey Bay, and they operate on a 5 to 7 year cycle of reporting back based on these condition report questions. So really what we were trying to do is facilitate that to be a more data-driven process, and then take that observational data and communicate it more effectively to the general public as well. And then now we're also focused on this global scale. How can we inform on the essential biological variables and the essential ocean variables towards the Sustainable Development Goal, particularly number 14, which is life below water? And how can we do that across these different scales of information, going from genetic or DNA information to species information to traits to whole communities? And keeping in mind the fact that we have different levels of complexity with our audiences, whether they're scientists or park managers or just general public, how can we facilitate communication between? So the targets, there's several targets outlined, including ocean acidification, but the ones that we're really focused on for the purpose of this work is ecosystems and marine protected areas and technology. So certainly based on observation of what lives where and when, we can start to inform on ecosystems and overlay that with marine protected areas and ask how much is protected. And then a lot of this effort really is facilitating technology transfer. So how can we enable people at a regional scale to inform in the best possible way about what lives in their very own backyard? And this is really, these are starter materials for engaging in that process. So fundamentally, MBON is a database with some data sets, and you want to be able to filter by taxa, space, and time, and produce things like maps and charts of abundance, and look at trends over time. So from an information perspective, that's what we're looking at. We can also take observation and then enrich that observation by understanding other taxonomic traits, maybe conservation status, phylogenies, and then also look at what else co-occurs with that observation, environmental data, political boundaries and protections, and then use the combination to then inform on what's the distribution and diversity. And then again, also look at that in kind of space and in time. So here's what the rest of what we're going to focus on is the meat, which is an approach here where there's an Explorer app that's a little bit more oriented towards the scientists and managers that allows you to look at various biological layers, mostly coming from the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, or OBIS, which is our global data commons of observation. And then also look at NASA satellite data, and that such as sea surface temperature and chlorophyll, and then another MBON-derived product from Maria Kavanaugh et al. On seascapes, looking at combination therein, and then being able to create plots at a global scale or other regional scale of interest that then you could kind of weave together to tell a story. And that Enrique is going to next talk in detail about how to weave a story from the data using this other product, which is a little bit more oriented towards the public. And the idea is that we can have these silhouettes of different elements in the ecosystem that you can then click on and check the status of where it's been. So you can click on it, and then you see Here's the distribution. Oh, and it's on the rise, and it's much higher than in times past. And what does that mean? And then what are the subsequent implications and the interactions of other elements in that habitat? So we're going to do a live demo in a bit, but first I want to embark on that storytelling journey, and that's what Enrique, you're going to do next. And these are all, by the way, available at mbon.marine. Well, you can just go to marinebond.org and go from there.
Oh, thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Everyone connected remotely. So as Ben was saying, I'm going to be talking about how a user will utilize these infographics to get a grasp of what's going on with the ecosystem and how ecosystems are responding to disturbances. So the overall idea of this is that the MBON seeks to provide a tool that can integrate disparate and complex data sets that are collected by a number of independent programs here in the United States by NOAA, the USGS, and the Florida Wildlife Commission. All of these generate very complex data sets that are not easily managed by people that are not experts. So we're hoping that through this tool, we can aggregate these disparate data sets and combine them with satellite imagery to generate a tool that can help management address the challenges of understanding how biodiversity and overall ecosystem health is changing at global scales, even regional scales, and local scales. And I will be focusing on the local scales through the infographics. All of this to support local management needs, even country level needs, but also to inform SDG 14. So for those that are not familiar with what the U.S. National Marine Sanctuaries are, these are jurisdictions in the United States that have some similarities to marine protected areas and are under NOAA's governance. And they, as Ben was saying, go through a periodic cycle of reporting the condition report, the conditions of the National Marine Sanctuaries, and basically doing this by addressing a set of questions, for example, like these two that I have here. What is the condition of biologically structured habitats, and how is it changing over time? Or what's the status of key species in the ecosystem, and how these species are changing over time? All of these questions are addressed in this report, and the hope is that this tool can help managers in the sanctuaries respond these questions in a very simple manner. So we're going to be focusing on two iconic sanctuaries. These are the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary and the Florida Keys. And we're talking about these two sanctuaries because these are the regional domains of the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network demonstration in the United States. Each of these sanctuaries have a very complex ecosystem composed by, for example, in the Monterey Bay, rocky shore, sandy beaches, kelp forest. But for the Monterey Bay, I will be focusing on the pelagic ecosystem, and for the Florida Keys on the coral reef ecosystem for the purpose of this demonstration. But we're working on these other infographics so that they become available very soon. So this, as Ben was saying, this tool is conceived to support managers and stakeholders detect and understand changes, responses of the ecosystem to specific disturbances in a simple manner. So as I was saying before, I'm going to focus these next few slides to these two ecosystems: the pelagic environment in the Monterey Bay and the coral reef ecosystem in the Florida Keys. And I will try to illustrate how a user can utilize these tools to understand how the ecosystems and overall biodiversity in these systems respond to very specific disturbances, and in this case, in the form of sea surface temperature anomalies. I will be relating to the cold snap event in 2010 that we observed in the Florida Keys. And you can see, for example, in this satellite image, this is a sea surface temperature anomaly map for January 2010. And you can see that the very blue areas are areas that were extremely cold for that month, something between 3 and 4 degrees C, colder than usual over the last at least 15 years. And this particular event had a major impact on the ecosystem. This led to massive coral and fish die-offs. And so this this is a perfect example of how a user would utilize this tool to understand the effects of this event on the ecosystem. And right now, if you go to the infographic and you click on that thermometer there, you get a time series of sea surface temperature anomaly since the early 90s, and it's very clear that 2010 was a very extremely cold winter. So, but why focusing on the coral reef ecosystems? Well, the sanctuaries invest a large portion of their resources to the coral reef ecosystems because this particular ecosystem, more than seagrasses and maybe mangroves, have been degrading steeply since the 80s. Over the last 2 decades, we've been losing coral cover very quickly. So it's an important element of attention to the sanctuary. So the user would be, after this event, would be asking, well, what happened to the fish populations, for example, in the Florida Keys after this cold snap event? We know that there was a massive event of fish die-offs, and I'm interested in knowing what happened to very specific groups of fish that may have important roles in the ecosystem. In this case, I'm referring to parrotfish, for example. These are very important animals in the coral reefs because they remove macroalgae that grow on the corals. Macroalgae on the corals is really bad because basically they shadow the corals and they can kill them. So this would be an important element to track and see how it responded to this cold event. So by clicking on that icon, on that silhouette of the parrotfish, the user would realize that during that year, 2010, the abundance of these animals decreased significantly. So the next question, well, let's see what the effect on the macroalgae cover was that for that year. And by clicking on the coral reef icon, it would be able to get a time series plot of percent macroalgae cover for that, and since the beginning of the record, and would realize that 2010, the macroalgae cover went up the roof. It was just off the charts, and possibly could make that linkage, that connection between the loss of herbivory and the growth of macroalgae. So this hopefully relates to the kind of stories that we need to tell to the public. Now, switching to the Monterey Bay. As I said, I will be focusing this demonstration on the pelagic environment, but keep in mind that this is a very complex ecosystem, and that we're, for the purpose of this demonstration, we're focusing only on this section on this habitat in particular. We're also, I'm going to be utilizing a similar disturbance, but in this case, it was a warming event that happened in 2015 through 2016. And what you see in the map here is the sea surface temperature anomaly for December 15, sorry. And these are the limits of the national marine sanctuaries. And what this is highlighting is that for that particular month, the temperature of the surface water were extremely warm. And you can also see that by clicking on the temperature icon on the infographics, you get the time series record for the sea surface temperature anomaly. And you quickly realize that this was an unusually warm event, and this actually was all over the news and was known as was referred to as the warm blob, but now more formally is known as the marine heat wave. It's nicer. So the user would be, okay, what the effects of the warm blob were on this ecosystem? Well, let's walk our way up from the base of the food chain all the way up to the top. And so let's see what happened to the phytoplankton, to the microalgae. One of the effects is that for that year, it is possible that this warm event led to massive phytoplankton blooms in this area, in the sanctuary. And blooms of algae can be a good thing. These fuel the food chain, and lots of, it's the way that energy gets into the system. But sometimes these blooms include algae that produce toxins and affect the ecosystems. And for that particular year, there was a massive harmful algal bloom that coincided with the warm blob. Many animals got sick. They found the toxins on sea lions, on fish and more concerning on the fish crab fisheries. And that led to the closure of the Dungeness crab fisheries, the longest closure ever recorded in history over the 25 years. So this particular event had major implications for management. A second effect that this warm blob event had on the ecosystem is that the diversity of the forage fish was off the charts. Never seen that level of diversity, of a species richness of the forage fish for this ecosystem of the 25 years of this survey. Now, forage fish are all of these small animals that many other organisms rely on, like sea lions, whales, other type of fish. So for that particular year, 2015, the diversity, the richness, species richness of the forage was staggering. So now the user would be asking themselves, is higher biodiversity a good thing or is it a bad thing? Not necessarily. That also coincided with a very important decrease, or also a disappearance of key forage species such as anchovy and some species of krill, from which whales and sea lions depend on. Basically, in the area of the survey of these organisms, the anchovy and the sardines and the krill just disappeared. They were not seen anywhere, and so we already see some connections between this warm event and an important element of dietary element of this ecosystem. Now, the user would click on the California sea lion silhouette on the infographic, and it would quickly realize it would extract a time series of mean pup weight of sea lions, and it becomes very clear that during 2015 the California sea lions reproduction was strongly hit. We detected that these animals were reproducing with some complications. The pups were not being able to keep their weight, and that coincided with a large number of these pups being washed up to the beaches all along California, malnourished, simply because their food item was not fully available to them. And 2015 was also an atypical year in terms of whale entanglements, and the highest ever recorded. And this was possibly related to the fact, that all of these anchovy and krill that whales depend on were way too close to shore, not in the areas where they are typically surveyed. So all of these food items are way too close to the shore, and for that year, that led to important interactions between whales and fishing gear and even humans. Now, having whales close to shore can be a good thing for ecotourism, but this is something that needs to be controlled and managed carefully. And this is what I have for the infographics, and now Ben is going to walk us through the live demonstration. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Enrique. Good stuff. So, yeah, and these examples are very powerful when you're trying to communicate this sort of thing to stakeholders of the ocean. We heard a very compelling story from Jared Santora about having to communicate with the crab fishermen what's going on with the whale strandings. And there's all this backstory of these ecological interactions and seeing this effect from the warm blob, and having these storytelling devices on hand is a great way to get there. So where I clicked here is the marinebond.org. There's a button now for SDG products, and now it takes us to this landing page where we can go to the Explorer and the infographics. So just for an example here of what an infographics looks like, something's up with that resolution here. I don't normally use Explorer either, so I'm like, how do I bump up the size? Zoom! Control plus. Okay, let's Control plus away here. Wow, okay, we should definitely do some cross-browser experience checks. But we can see, for instance, here's the forage fish. Wow, and this thing is wants to right-click on everything. Okay, and now let me control minus so we can. Whoops. Okay, this is like I said, hot off the press. So some things, yeah. But we see here phytoplankton biomass. So you can also, with this sort of thing, you can zoom in on a given segment of the year and look at it in detail, and then hover to get the time point of interest. So this is just an infographic that links to the data that's, in this case, a time series. And you can go through and look at the state of the sea lion. Here's the poor pups losing body weight and not being able to find food given these conditions. Sorry, I'm having some. Woo! Wow, it's a mouse with a mind of its own. Okay, so that's that example, and the coral reef example works similarly. And now I'm gonna start talking about, on a global scale, how could you, for instance, craft some of these graphics yourself? How could you make some maps and make some time series plots and weave that into your own story that you want to tell as a scientist? So this is an explorer to be able to do that. And I'll actually start with the environmental data, just similarly building up from the food web. So what we see here, let me control plus so we get a little bit bigger. Here we've got chlorophyll, and we can zoom around. Wow, and it'll update, or we could hit play, and it'll iterate through these monthly images, and we can even keep on zooming and check it out. But then if we wanted to, for instance, okay, what's going on for a given EEZ, for instance? So these polygons of interest are the exclusive economic zones, so nationals, country waters. These polygons could be other reporting units of interest. It could be an ecological and biologically significant area, such as the CBD is organizing, or something else. So right now, like I said at the beginning, we want to look at things in space, and we also want to look at things in time. So if I click on a given EEZ, then I can also look temporally. And here we see from the record from the Modus Aqua data set over time for Mexico, and we see the variation within the Mexico's EEZ as well as the mean along. And again, I love, wow, mouse. So we can zoom into an area of interest, and then we can look also at things like temperature and see how that then varies. And let's say we wanted to, wow, come on, clicker. Okay, so let's say we wanted to save that plot and tell a story about that involves SST. And then maybe I go back to the chlorophyll. So the radio button allows me to select something of interest, the layer of interest. I could click on that layer and also get information about it. We need metadata. Don't duck the metadata. I had a little squeaky duck that said that, don't duck the metadata, on my desk from a metadata workshop. And then let's look at something that combines the two of these. So these are seascapes, are ordinated classes. So what's a seascape? Well, let's click on this guy and find out. So there are 14 classes of seascapes that come from an ordination looking at different attributes of ocean color, including sea surface temperature and chlorophyll. And there's a reference that you can check out to find out more from Kavanaugh et al., who's in the room right here. And so let's say we want to save that seascape for Mexico, and we could also similarly zoom to a different time period of interest and then save that plot. And interesting classes here. Okay, and we can add a little caption that captures our current thinking about it. We can also look at, of course, seascapes over time, and we can see how these different classes change in area. So rather than being a mean value, this is a percent area that inhabits, winks in and out with seasonal variation for the area of interest. So now we've got some plots that we've saved. Let's look and see what's happening to the biology. So we can change that. And now we can look at, say, species richness for Mexico. Let's go ahead and save that plot. Species map for Mexico. And then we can look at the number of observations. Whoops. So that's the metadata, not the selection. Now I've selected that layer. And this is the number of observations from OBIS. And then this is a protection metric. So the protection metric, this is just an example of something that we recently are in progress working on. The idea is, can we look at, for instance, the number of OBIS observations and look at their extinction risk and look at the average extinction risk of animals that we've observed inside marine protected areas compared to outside protected areas. So if that's balanced, then the metric would come up with a value of 0.5. If it's if there's no representation in marine protected areas and there's highly endangered species outside, then that would be a value of 0 and vice versa. So 1 is good and 0 is bad. But this is actually an example of, this is not a one-off description. This is a platform to create these kinds of products. So this is very much a prototype of a platform so that you can create something similar yourself. So let's save this, and I'm gonna inquire about this one. Okay. So now I save this. Okay, so now I've got some graphics that I can weave into a final map. So I can go back and maybe I want to tweak some of these things. So I can go back to the time series and open that up. And maybe I want to change I want to really zoom into the annual variation. Okay, so what we can do then is we can bookmark this. And what that does is it gives it a URL that we could then send to a colleague who then goes to their web browser and, okay, whatever. So now they would see this same image of all those plots that we just created. Better yet, maybe what we could do is we could save this report as a PDF and we could send that to them. And so now it's generating a PDF from all those different plots we created to try to do that same storytelling. And let's open. Let's see where it opens. Okay, so we see here we've got the temperature, we've got the seascapes, we've got the number of species, and we've got a protection metric. We can also generate a Word doc that looks very similar, or even a standalone web page that could be sent as an attachment. And the cool thing about the web page is that it's still interactive, so you can still zoom in and out and pan around, whether it's a time series or a map. And can I open this? I thought we just saved it. Sorry, I'm very, okay, open. Very Internet Explorer naive. Okay, cool. All right, so here we get that interactivity, and we can zoom in and out with the time series. Similarly with the map, we can zoom in and out, and we get a scale bar. So this becomes, again, just very great storytelling devices. And let me go back to the presentation to emphasize what else is going on here. Okay, so just to recap, we're looking at biological data. We want to be able to slice and dice this. We didn't quite get there by depth and taxa. The queries were just running a little too slowly. There's other technology we're going to implement called Elasticsearch to enable that. But we were able to pretty agilely look at the environmental data with respect to, in this case, the regions being the exclusive economic zone, and view it in space and in time, and create and save these plots for later reuse. Oh, okay, well, I'll just say that there's a link at all the reports that get generated that allows you to go back and visit those plots, and then you can tweak them from there and regenerate your own new one. Okay. So, and then we looked at chlorophyll over time, and temperature and over time, and then these seascapes, which is an ordination technique, and over time. And then we looked at OBIS data, and it's our global data commons, but if we actually just slice the shallowest 20 meters, we see that we have a lot of data gaps. And a big impetus for this work is to create tools that are fundamentally part of the reporting process, even at national scales, that encourage data to be uploaded into this global data commons, so that it gets the most use, and we have transparency in our decision making. And there's also a development earlier this year that really enables us to include more data where we can actually come up with true measures of abundance estimates that are really important for management by including surveys of where we looked and where we didn't look, and other ancillary information described in this DePuter et al. Paper. And so we looked at biological data, and we combined the Protected Planets World Database of Protected Areas and the IUCN Red List to then come up with a new metric, and that's one case study. We'll have this taxonomic slicing and dicing very soon. You can save all your plots, then you can report out, and this is, again, it can be used at the global, local, or regional levels for these types of infographics. This is part of this larger vision of being able to consume globally available data, even combining it with local data, whether that's citizen science or otherwise, and having a regional platform for the spatial database, the analytical engine, and the front-end user interface that then creates products that are relevant to the essential biological variables like species, communities, and ecosystems, and allows synthesis for even novel or derived products that go back to a portal like OBIS. And everything that we presented here is built open source, and it's meant very much to welcome you all as a community to contribute towards it. So there are most of the developing world happens these days on GitHub. It's a public versioning system for code, and we have these repositories, one SDG14, to spin up the server environment that has all of the analytical engine that does GeoServer. It's containerized in a Docker system, and it has R, statistical programming language, with the Shiny user interface, and a bunch of other elements that enable all of what I just showed you to be completely encapsulated in one machine. You can even spin up these machines. You get 60 days for free on Google Cloud. You get a year for free on Amazon. So we're talking about cheaply available resource, free or super cheap, to be able to spin up these environments to create these products. On the infographic side, it's an R package, which is very easy to use. You just feed the data into a little function, and it wires up your illustrated scene of elements with your data time series, and we're creating other sorts of plots and outputs. The beauty of that is that any dumb website can host the outputs of that. So you don't even have to spin up a server environment. Any dumb website, even GitHub, can host it for free. The interactivity happens on the browser side, so yeah. We want to continue improving these products and working with these many organizations listed here and these many initiatives to really facilitate better storytelling at a fundamental level and data-driven decision-making. And there are other efforts that are a little bit fancier with their production value, like these dashboards that the IU's group is looking at. And we think that this could be an early adopter of some of these methods that you could define and then carry on in a more production level environment. So build your own story. We got some tools to help you out. We want to really engage with you all, and you can contribute and improve upon this and appeal to your audience, and we can update this in near real time and communicate complex stories and enhance our global data commons. So we just want to open the floor for discussion. Here's a few to chew on, but really any comments, suggestions, questions are most welcome. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ben Bess, Enrique Montes. Questions for Ben or Enrique? Yep, I'm going to bring you the mic so the live streamers can hear.
Thank you, and it's absolutely fascinating to what you've developed. I had a couple questions. I guess the first one is you showed EEZs, and you gave the example of Mexico, which I think it's a very appropriate example for my question. Mexico straddles two EEZs in terms of Atlantic and sort of Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and it seemed like you only had one figure of sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, et cetera, for Mexico. So I'm curious as to how you're dealing with those two very different habitats in terms of, or two different regions in terms of both physical and biological variables.
Yeah, so that is a great question and one that we chewed on, and I almost split these suckers up like last night and this morning, but the caution is the better part of valor, or so they say, so I didn't want to break things too much, but it would have been a nice transition, for instance, to go from Enrique's presentation about discussing the warm blob or the marine heat wave at the local scale to then looking at just the West Coast component of the United States Continental's EEZ. So the exclusive economic zone product from marine regions, right? It has the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, just like Mexico. The Atlantic and Pacific portions are in the same polygon or multi-polygon. So, maybe tomorrow I'll break that up. But it really goes to the point of, hey, I want to see something more specific, and the fact that you have not just a website, but you have a platform to do that. We can definitely do that. So I think Frank wants to add to that.
This is a very, very good point. And we have been grappling with this almost from the beginning. Which data do you disaggregate into different parts of EEZs that straddle different oceans, which you don't? A country may be interested in knowing, for example, what's the OBIS data records for the entire country, the aggregated, or what's the proportion of this protected species index for the entire country, and that may be one case in which you want to keep it all together. It's as a simple metric for the entire nation. But you're right. And in this case, we are averaging temperature from the Pacific and the Atlantic, which makes absolutely no sense, right? And yet, if you want to see what is the temperature for my waters in my country aggregated, that's one way to do it. Most of the countries don't have this problem, but a few do. So this is something that we have to sort out, but maybe with a submenu. But yeah, so suggestions welcome.
Split it up. Yep, Enrique.
So one way that we've been thinking about to address this issue is to build a capability in the tool that allows the user to choose their own arbitrary polygons and explore very specific areas. But that will come soon, I guess.
Really interesting tool. I have a comment or more like a question. Do you guys have a online community forum where end users go and post questions and provide you feedback and those type of things, so you guys can interact with end users in a much easier fashion?
So we have something very nerdy, very geeky called GitHub Issues. But that's been part of our internal conversation. But we should definitely have a little feedback button that's a simple form that people could post from wherever they navigated to. And also, because we have the story building device, we can also just have a link that says what they've created so far and restore the state of their environment, so that they don't have to explain what they're doing. We can kind of see it. I think that's a great suggestion. But it's been actually even an interesting experience within our group, because we're on both coasts, from California to Florida and folks in between, and using these online developer tools, a lot of the capacity even just within our group has improved, and so there's technical transference at multiple levels is all I wanted to allude to by mentioning that.
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating tool to reach out, or with great potential, especially the making it locally. I had two more technical questions. The first one is already touched, the scalability about beyond or going within the zones you currently have, or ideally having free scalability, because again, I believe, or from experience of other similar things, it's people locally who want to reach and who are interested in their local environment rather at national or even regional level. So I would encourage you to do that. Second question I have, whether have you in your portal sort of, or are you keeping track of individual searches and downloads in terms of DOIs or other identifiers? Because as far as I understand, you essentially act as a data aggregator of databases which are dynamic or constantly being updated, like iNaturalist or Obis.
We should at least get some Google Analytics on the people visiting these products, which is very easy to do these days, and we added metadata for where some of the, on the other side, where some of the data comes in from, and what we'll be hopefully working on more next is creating the sort of seamlessness. So as Obis and satellite data gets updated, then the feeds become truly near real time.
Yeah, but I think the one of the issues could be thinking ahead in the future that some of what the users do, again, create new, unique combinations of data set, and maybe it would be interesting to be able to keep track of them in the future for comparative analysis. So that's something for example, at the GBIF portal that was recently implemented. Try really to keep track of or attach automatically a DOI to every individual search and download. And again, that's something maybe
that's a good idea.
You can think of.
Cool.
Okay, let me get you a microphone.
Thanks. Hello. Have you thought about some way of using crowdsourcing to increase your data? For example, like nowadays every camera, cellular phone, or whatever takes a picture and with location. That at least in the coastal areas where people do snorkeling, that you can't upload the data and then having somebody identify a species, so you can increase the information.
Yeah, we have tried to submit some proposals in the past with, for instance, citizen science groups like iNaturalist. And it's pretty interesting because when you look at the OBIS, the Ocean Biogeographic Information System feeds into the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So that's ocean and terrestrial. And last year, for 2016, I think it was well over 90% of the observations that were fed in within the year were from iNaturalist, were from the citizen science projects. And this warm blob event that Enrique talked about in the Pacific was very much detectable by the citizens doing a lot of tide pooling. And in that case, you actually have specimen images associated to confirm the species identity, because there's always a photo. And then it's time-stamped and GPS stamped. And then there's community vetting with a scoring based on what species it is. And now they have it set up such that when you take a photo, it uses deep learning techniques to automatically classify and identify the species. So I think really the solution is partnership and encouragement for bio blitzes and citizen science, and seeing how their data then can be part of the global thinking and solution. I think is very empowering. So yeah, I think that's awesome. Yeah, thank you.
I was wondering how broad you are thinking about in terms of your users. I don't mean the people watching presentation, but the people actually using the capabilities, which are really impressive. The reason, it occurred to me watching it that it would be really good for teachers and students. You could do a lot of stuff educationally with it, and also internationally. But in that context, that also occurred to me that I don't know if you're thinking of doing any kind of translation tools for international applications, and also for certain educational settings, I think you might think about a little bit about some of the jargon that's in there. Even something like temperature anomaly is not going to be that a lot of people don't even understand what biodiversity is after all. So temperature anomaly, forage fish, SDG 14, think about how you can make a little bit more transparent some of the labels so that it to increase the usability for people who aren't like the people in this room.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. It's actually pretty easy to do something like Google Translate. It'll automatically translate. What's nice is that you can actually go into an edit mode so that somebody who's very familiar with the translation can do little tweaks, especially on menu items and the like. So I think we have to go there for the Pole to Bowl project, and the maybe even the possibility of like a technical description for things, and then a very accessible description, I think would be great. Those are really good suggestions. Thanks.
Okay. Another question?
I saw that one of your intended users was a NOAA ecosystem assessment, and my thought is that this kind of information would be useful for a variety of assessments, both within the United States and globally. For example, the National Strategic Biodiversity Plans, I'm forgetting, NBSAPs, National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, thank you, Woody, would be one really important key user of this information because they can sort of go and gather information about a place or their country of interest and include that in a report. And so kind of what efforts you are reaching out to those kinds of assessments could just be something that's really helpful down the road to increase the user base.
Yeah, and I think we're open to suggestions too. I think we are thinking in terms of broad applicability of the tool and interested in hearing feedback from potential users and thinking of a broad range of assessments as well. So I think I mentioned the ecosystem assessment just in response to another question, but that's not the only. We're looking at assessments of life in the oceans and at a global scale too. So do you want to speak to that? I think Frank had a comment.
Well, there's two things that I want to bring up. One is that this is being developed under an MBON pilot project, so there has to be a thought of long-term sustainability for something like this. What is going to be the home? It could be an MBON page, a portal that IUSE is developing. It could be an OBIS, but right now we're thinking about where is the ultimate home for something like this. The other thing is that this is completely open, and what we would like to do, one of the reasons for presenting this here at the GEO as a side event is to invite other countries to engage with this group and contribute. I think what Ben and Enrique and the team that developed this is really good, but we would like to have other groups engage with us and see what other capability we can bring if Colombia or Mexico or people in Europe want to contribute and put it in another language. That's the way to develop a tool like this, is a global partnership.
Hopefully we'll be doing some of that over the next couple of years.
I just wanted to comment that very quickly. So one of the things that we're thinking for this new project that we're very happy to have funded now, the Pole to Pole MBON, is to actually run workshops with Ben and the others to show people that are not experts, that are not programmers, how to build their own infographics for their own systems in a very simple manner. These infographics only require 4 basic elements for 4 types of files, and it's just a matter of adjusting, or maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but it's a matter of adjusting the code and knowing what the steps are for constructing your own infographics, for assessing your own ecosystems, and that's what we want to do for the Americas.
That's a great point, Enrique. So those infographics you develop are not the complete set by any means of infographics that could be developed. Because I mean, it's an open system. That's great. Yeah. All right. Other questions, comments? Obviously, the premise here is that time variable and annotated maps are a great platform for telling stories and getting information out there. So that's the the foundation for a storytelling system about marine biodiversity. All right, are we ready for our panel? Should we go? Okay. I'd like to ask Steve Giddings from the NOAA Office of Marine Sanctuaries and Pat Halpin from Duke University and Michael Ott from the IOC to come forward and to the table up front. Yeah, why don't y'all come up here? I think, is that, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You want 2 chairs?
So, okay, so
Yeah.
yeah,
Sit in
sorry.
the middle.
Yeah, please.
I did that once and
We're
fell
going
through.
to go
Sure.
in order. Do you want to?
Sure.
I think some have slides. I don't know if all do. But,
So Woody essentially introduced the idea behind the panel when we started, and introduced the panelists as well. The format is that we would ask each of them to speak for 5 minutes on that list of topics, any ones of those they would like to address. And then we would like to allow some time for discussion with the panel. So those topics, as a reminder, thinking about the value of observing marine biodiversity, which is a theme here today, advancing ocean observing by integrating marine biodiversity and biological observations with physical and biogeochemical, and the future of MBON. What tools, what global assessments of life in the sea, what other drivers are we trying to address through development of this network? So the order that I had it was Steve, then Pat, then Michael. Are we good with that? If so, then can I pop up your slides, Steve?
Sure.
Is that a good time? Okay.
See what happens.
See what happens.
So a few people have already alluded to one of the main purposes of the MBON pilot project was to help marine sanctuaries develop the condition reports that we write every few years for each marine sanctuary that really have to do with the status and trends with the water, habitat, living resources, and in our case also archaeological resources, but that's not part of MBON. But the first 3 are water, habitat, and living resource qualities and how they're changing. We have these 17 questions we ask every sanctuary to answer, and they each do it in their own context, depending on what are the most appropriate indicators for answering those questions at any given site. So they're all answered differently, but they answer the same questions. So that the origin of MBON is really along those lines. So I'm not going to dwell on that very much, simply because you'll go to sleep. But I've presented it plenty of times in the past. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the advancing of MBON and the future of MBON in context of the recent hurricane, because I just got back from 2 weeks of a damage assessment in the Florida Keys. These aren't the exact locations, but most of these pink locations are places we dropped with divers over a 2-week period to look at the damage caused by Hurricane Irma, which was a month and a half ago now. And I'm glad Nancy's still here. Hopefully she'll stay for a few minutes, but because nobody in this room probably seen more hurricane damage than Nancy over the years in the tropics. But and so she's got a lot of experience. But we wanted to see in the Florida Keys what the extent of damage was related to Hurricane Irma, because the marine sanctuary is getting a lot of pressure now in that particular place because of gradual deterioration that's happened in the Florida Keys, to do something about it. What do you do in the case of a hurricane? Should you do anything about it or should you not? Well, we have some important policy and management decisions to make related to how much we intervene following a natural event and man-made events on behalf of corals and other parts of the ecosystem. So doing damage assessment helps us get a better understanding. And for me, it was very personal, because 30 years ago this year, I wrote my dissertation on Molasses Reef, which is one of those pink spots up there, on the processes affecting recovery of a coral reef following mechanical damage. Hurricane happened during that period, but it was more about a ship grounding site. But doing a damage assessment for a hurricane was very similar to what I did way long ago for my dissertation. As my career slowly, winds down, I had a chance now to go back to places that some of which I hadn't been to since then, and see how things have changed and see whether those processes that I thought I understood back then are still holding up. So, next slide. So we went up and down the Keys for 2 weeks and saw what you'd expect in terms of storm damage for a coral reef, toppled corals and so forth, with the more intense destruction being in the places with the more intense wind patterns down in the lower Keys. That's a simply a coral we uprighted, and the things that happen are the things you'd expect, some bleaching and death of tissues that are toppled corals. And you can turn them upright if you want. The question is whether you should or not, because by the time a few weeks roll around, not only are the tissues dead under those corals, but other animals are taking up residence under the colonies. And surprising to me, one of the colonies that I just happened to turn up because it was there, and it was just instinct to do it, had a diadema under it. But I only saw maybe 6 diadema the entire trip. And as most of you know, that sea urchin died back in the 80s and caused immeasurable consequences to change in the coral reefs in the Florida Keys. But here was one living under a newly created habitat from an overturned coral. So I started questioning how much the decaying tissues on those corals actually feed critters underneath the corals after they turn over. Go ahead. And then there were also areas where there was extreme blowout activity from a really intense wave action, probably in certain spots. Very localized, but intense where it occurred. This is some mid-channel reef areas in the southern Keys where they're underlain by bivalves more than they are a cropper and other coral bones that make up a lot of the reefs up in the underlayment of the Keys and upper reefs. But you could see places where the crust was broken free and caused this cascading effect of removal of underlying sediments and little landslides that caused coral destruction and so forth. But again, not something you wouldn't expect in a catastrophic storm of this level. Next. Surprisingly, gorgonians and other species of soft corals did pretty well in the storm. It's a little surprising to me. There was a fair amount of removal, but not as much as I thought there would be. But you can see the turbidity there. That was the typical visibility for 2 weeks. We were down there for most of the time, anywhere from 2 feet to 20, 30 feet visibility. Next slide. And then debris of all different types, but by far the majority being not this. This is some stainless steel wire wrapped around a staghorn coral. Next slide. This is more what we saw, lobster traps everywhere. Most of them smashed and broken apart, but a few of them ghost fishing, still with lines attached. And then a mangrove tree out on Conch Reef, not far from Aquarius, the underwater habitat, wrapped with 3 traps. Next slide. And then this is where it started getting interesting to me, was the sponge damage. Up in the northern Keys where the storm was less intense, to some extent less intense, sponges had the kind of damage I thought they would. Abrasions, some toppling and some shearing off of the sponges, sometimes even down at the base. But in all likelihood, a lot of them will grow back from what's left. Down in the lower Keys, it was very different. We started seeing more and more lesions on the sponges, which are white areas with dead tissue. And if you wave your hand at the white area, water would go right through it, so you'd see sediment coming out the other side, whereas in live tissue you don't see that. But then there were large areas in the southern Keys with completely dead Zestospongia populations. I say completely, but I mean I might see one live one on an entire dive and 40-something dead ones. So very high percentage died from choking, it looks like, on sediments that either came from resuspension or from maybe the Florida Bay discharge. Next slide. And that was the most striking thing to me, was seeing all these dead sponges, and even sponges that had some living tissue still around the tops. If there were lesions around the bottom, the sponges were separating from those lesions and were going to break off with the next any energy at all. And that's what happened with this one, is just laying in the sand. Go ahead. This just shows a really, well, this is right behind American Shoal, if any of you are familiar, right off Cujo Key where the eye of the storm came ashore. And it shows a blowout area with a little bit of healthy framework still around. But there's on the left a white, completely dead sponge decaying. If you went up and touched it, it would start to flake off, fall apart. So you can see the blowout area in there as well. This is the kind of catastrophic destruction that happened in very limited local areas just around the eye of the storm. Next. And then satellite imagery, and this gets us to the MBON and the observing systems and how they could help and could have helped even more if I'd handled this crews better, how they could have helped us interpret what we were seeing along the way. And this is kind of the challenge for MBON. How do you translate the really good work that you guys are doing so fast and coming up with really good products that can be outputs from these databases on the fly and make them truly interactive during an operational phase like this? Not just writing condition reports, but on the fly. So I would have loved to have full access to time series graphics like this that show me where sediments are, where they're not, and overlain by other kinds of information of various types, whatever they might be, so that we could make some predictions and select sites that were appropriate for doing damage assessments, and have that information available as we were out there. Which gets to the idea of manning our cruises a little bit differently than we do now, to have information specialists either readily available or on board to do this kind of interpretation while everybody else is doing the grunt work of diving and so forth. And having on board people like we were talking about before, storytellers, media folks. We tried to get that halfway through the cruise, get some media folks on board to tell the stories of what we were seeing. Didn't work out. So then we were challenged by the same things that everybody is. You're offshore, it's hard to communicate with people onshore. So just in terms of thinking about the future of MBON, I like to think in terms of things like this, being able to interpret on the fly, act interactively with the databases that you all, and we did have internet access out there through a little gadget that somebody gave us. And most of the time, once we were down around Cujo Key where the real damage happened, it was tough to get internet there. But most of the time we did have some access to the internet that we could have used this information for. And then the other challenge is, how do we take the great work that's going on now and think in terms of forecasting? As we think in terms of sanctuary management now, if we're going to be restoring corals out there now, we're going to be uprighting them, securing them to the reef. There are people who are going to be doing some of that. We're really doing it for us as humans, not for nature, because you could never upright enough corals to make a big difference there. But we have to start thinking in the marine sanctuary down there, what's our future with regard to restoration of this reef ecosystem? Should we be more actively intervening in terms of recruitment of or nursery growth of corals, or maybe even something on a larger scale where we're trying to reintroduce diadema at a large scale, and what are the effects of such things going to be? So being able to use some of the type of data that you all are working on to be able to predict what the outcomes of such major efforts would help us on the management side support or not those kinds of efforts. So taking this to the forecasting level is something I challenge you all to start thinking about now.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent. I discovered I have a clicker.
Oh.
So I'm going to give you that. It's just the arrows, and I'll load you up over here.
All right. See if this will work. Well, while she's bringing it up, I'm Pat Halpin from Duke University. Several times today already, the topic of the Census of Marine Life and OBIS and other programs have come up, and it's kind of hard to believe that those things started 17 years ago. And I was at the origin, I was on the steering committee leading the mapping efforts for the census and also the beginning of OBIS. So we're almost on 20 years. I'm going to take a pretty big, broad perspective and talk about the three questions. So they gave us these three questions, and they're pretty big ones, and the value of observing marine biodiversity, advancing ocean observing, and the future of MBON, and all in 5 minutes. So I'm going to talk really fast. Everybody ready? Okay. So what I wanted to do is talk about the value of observing marine biodiversity, and I put four main topics here, and I see ecological understanding as the top on the list, and that's my bias as a scientist, but I think it's fundamental to all the other steps. I mean, we really need to start understanding how these ecosystems work. But then there's other steps, managing the emerging blue economy, and that's another area that's going to make it more relevant to the non-scientist community and really relevant to the economics and the value. Also supporting ocean planning and, acronym here, area-based management tools. And then the last one is there's a lot of emerging changes at the UN right now on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and new treaty negotiations. So those are three areas that I think are four areas that I think are really high value for this whole process. And so we think about ecological understanding, understanding biogeographic patterns, ocean health and condition, ocean connectivity, and ocean change. And I could have gone on with the list, but that kind of filled most of a PowerPoint slide, so I thought I'd stop there. But those are, to me, some of the biggest topics right now. And the connectivity and ocean change issues are probably far beyond what the MBON scope is at present, but that's where I see it going. So I'm kind of trying to push where we're going to go farther with these topics. The managing the emerging blue economy, this is something we see just growing really rapidly right now. And there's a seemingly unlimited expansion in industrializing the oceans, and we really need to come up with better new tools to effectively measure, monitor, and sustainably use the oceans. And so this is something I think could help with MBON and OBIS and other initiatives on trying to tie the value of what we're doing to the economic value. And that's a paper that we put out earlier this year. Area-based management. I'm heavily involved with ocean planning in the US and the Atlantic coast, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. Also involved quite a bit with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity on selecting ecologically or biologically significant areas on a global scale. And I just want to put both these scales up here because this is where a lot of ocean planning and area-based management, marine protected area planning is occurring, and we're data starved. And it's kind of interesting because we just developed over 5,000 GIS data layers for the Mid-Atlantic region of the U.S., and we still don't have nearly enough data. It scares the hell out of the regulators and people that there's that much data, but we really are only scratching the surface, mainly on the macrofauna and not on the microfauna. And so, you need data to be able to make decisions. And on the global scale, in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, it's a huge issue on where's the biodiversity in the ocean, where are the important bits. Areas beyond national jurisdiction are a big topic because we've mentioned already 70% of the planet is ocean, 64% of that is beyond jurisdictional boundaries. And so this is kind of the Wild West of the world, and we need to be able to come up with better tools, a lot of the management and legal tools to be able to do biodiversity management. The reason I'm bringing this up is that this is a huge issue for a rationale for doing a better job of monitoring biodiversity data, because if you're going to actually effectively manage these places, we need to know about them. So the second point was advancing ocean observing. Three main topics here. One is we need to build on the existing infrastructure. I don't think we should go and create new systems. We have some structure there. They just need to be built out. We need to proactively target our knowledge and knowledge gaps, and we need to move to much more of a three-dimensional paradigm of how we view the oceans. So just to have a slide on each of those topics, we already have the Essential Ocean Variables program under GOOSE, under GeoBON and MBON, Essential Biodiversity Variables, and then under IOC and OBIS, Ocean Biogeographic Information System. And I think we need to build out all of these and make them much more interoperable. So I don't think we need to recreate the wheel, we just need to build these things up and make them work. To proactively target data, I think we need to do a better job of thinking about where are data gaps. And I thought I'd show one illustration to make a point here. If we're thinking about how you might be able to use other kinds of information gathering, like platforms of opportunity, one thing we could do is look in this example. This is the first map, is areas where we have biodiversity data in the oceans. The second map is where we actually have ships plying the oceans. And getting a ship out on site, especially in the mid-ocean, is the most expensive variable. And so what we can do is then look at, here's the places that have lots of ships going through them that have low amounts of biodiversity records. And even more important, these are the places in the ocean that have absolutely no data, but have ships going through them. And so for me, this is a way, and I just use this as an example, how could you target, kind of surgically target topics and gaps to go after? And I think the next generation of MBON needs to start thinking this way. Okay, how do we actually go after things and think about where can we target gaps very specifically? Another topic is truly thinking about the oceans as a 3D volume. And two papers, I was co-author on this year, came out looking at new database designs to actually start to do this. So this is something that people have been wringing their hands about for years. We actually have the technology and the ability to start actually rolling this out and implementing it. So I think starting to look at true volumes in data is something that's essential into the future. The last one is the future of MBON. So I picked 3 topics here. One was the Sustainable Development Goals. How do we actually relate it to those? One is looking at the relationship of EBVs and EBSAs, and the third is connectivity issues. So the first one is the ocean, SDG 14, EBSAs, and then looking at migratory species, which is another area I think MBON has not started to approach, but I see that's on the horizon. What's cool is this is exactly the same 3 points that Ben had in his slide. Ben, who was my past student, I think he got it right, nailed it. Good, Ben. All right. And but the issues were, if you winnow out all the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 3 main things that relate to MBON: sustainably managing the oceans, 10% conservation of the oceans, and developing research capacity and technology transfer. So those are the 3 big themes if you want to winnow it down to those core areas. This is one that I've been very interested in. I'm working closely with the Convention on Biological Diversity on the identification of ecologically or biologically significant areas across the oceans within EEZs and also in areas beyond national jurisdiction. There's currently around 280 sites that have been identified so far. I see these as potential test cases that could be used in future rollouts of MBON. They're kind of perfect archetypical sites that have already been selected for their ecological importance, and they're already been selected at high value, covering all the different ecosystems in the oceans. So we kind of already have a pre-selected test case of great places to monitor. And then the last thing, and this is also an issue that we're trying to develop right now to get ahead of the curve, is we're looking a lot right now. MBON is looking very much at coastal benthic environments, and that's great. I mean, that's a wonderful place to start. But there's also all the connectivity of animals that swim between ecosystems across jurisdictions in that dynamic environment. And so we've been developing a new database called MICO, which is a Migratory Connectivity of the Oceans database, to try to start to see if we can fill in those gaps on connectivity in the ocean. So I see this as another area that MBON or MBON-like activities can move towards. All right. Try to go as fast as I could.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. I know there are questions for both of you so far, but we'll just hold them for discussion after. And there it is. You have the clicker, Mike?
I do.
Thank you. It's not opening. Oh. It's not doing anything. That's awkward.
I guess the mouse. Strange.
Oh, that's it.
Oh, there it is.
It's just a delay.
All right. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm not a biologist, so I won't regale you with great pictures, but hopefully I'll be able to let you know that we're really looking to support marine biodiversity and also to get your feedback and your input into how we can help you. So I'll touch on a number of things which were just touched on in both of the talks. So IOC's role then in biodiversity and sustainable development is really to foster technology transfer, capacity, data management, data collection, data use, analysis, in a whole system to build up a value chain, which is the only way that in the end it'll be sustainable. So IOC itself has a number of projects or initiatives, and I've just listed 4 here. Marine spatial planning, which is a key tool to implement ecosystem-based management, and IOC has taken a lead role in this and in education surrounding it. The large Marine Ecosystem Learn project to improve global-based governance of LMEs and their coasts. Again, an engine for achieving SDG 14 that's available to download. The value of ecosystem services, if we can put a a better price on ecosystem services, then we can argue more for conservation and even for monitoring. And in fact, we have just starting in a week or two, someone who will be jointly seconded to IOC, OECD, but based at IOC to look at some of these issues. And in fact, there's a whole series on how do we cost both the monitoring and the results here at this exact site event yesterday and today. Future of the Seas and Oceans is a G7 action on the blue economy. And in fact, and I want to get this right, so the G7 supports the achievement of SDG 14 and requires the monitoring of climate change and biodiversity in order to do that. And as part of IOC's work with G7, we're involved with this blueprint, which is a long-term roadmap for developing an integrated ocean observing system for the Atlantic, which was born out of the Atlantos project, which I'll come back to. But our hope is that this blueprint roadmap will be given to the G7 in time for them to start making decisions. People have already talked about OBIS, so I won't do that again, but more generally, IODE has a data portal, has education such as Ocean Teacher, has capacity development, including IOC's capacity development strategy, which clearly indicates that the role of education and technology marine transfer is to ensure that all countries share equally from both the blue economy and from the protection of marine resources, whether that's biological, genomic, etc. So you've seen some of these plots already, so I won't go into it again. The Global Ocean Observing System is working to integrate ocean observations both across panels, so across biology and ecology, ecosystems with physics and biogeochemistry, and across networks wherever they are, involved in sustaining and improving observing systems, whether that's funding or more integration, also involved with standards and best practices. The Goose put out the Framework for Ocean Observing, which again was already talked about, requirements based on conventions, biodiversity and ecosystems are key needs, essential ocean variables, which you already mentioned. And so again, on the right here, we see this value chain, which is really the key for the framework, in that, you can, for some time, you can set up an ocean observing system, and you can even make it pretty good, but if you don't respond to end user needs and it's not fit for purpose, then eventually it's just going to die in the vine. So there was a recent, just last month, in fact, Regional Alliance Forum for the Goose observing system, and the Goose Regional Alliances, which are kind of mapped there on the bottom, are the closest entities of Goose to the coasts, and so they're the groups that interact mostly with the biology. And at this 8th session, then, a number of highlights. Goose and the IOC are working on a proposal to develop a joint program on integrated coastal observation system, and biodiversity is key there. Pilot areas need to be identified. That's a natural fit for MBON. We need to, they also explored new partnerships between the regional alliances and other programs, including, I've already mentioned the LMEs, but also the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Goose Regional Council agreed on 18 actions, and number 14 is to support the Goose Bioeco Panel on capacity building. Atlantos, I mentioned briefly, was an EU project to coordinate ocean observing in the Atlantic Ocean, and there's a number of work packages. In terms of analysis, there's capacity and gaps analysis, simulated ocean simulation experiments, costing studies, sensor and tech roadmaps, all to better integrate across the panel, so to get biology sensors on physical platforms, vice versa, to find out what's really needed, what's the best bang for the buck, and this is where we need your input. Ocean applications, there are a number that we had a whole session on that ran late just before this one, which deals with biology. I won't go into those. Enhancing observations, so we have integration workshops across the panels again, and in each of these 3 work packages on the bottom here, ship-based, autonomous, and cross-cutting, biology was identified as a key lack, a key need, including genomics and metagenomics. So this is where we need input as well. So one of the key outputs of Atlantis already is this ocean monitoring tool, which is a customizable, real-time monitoring tool of the observation systems that are out there. And obviously not everyone's done these metrics, and key performance indicators so far are mostly on the physical side, but we're working to include biogeochemistry and biology, and again, we solicit your help in that. So there's dashboards, you can click on time history to find out how it's going. So the last 2 things then, these are the hopefully the take-home messages and what we really want your help with. The Global Ocean Science Report was just published a month or 2 ago, and it's the first global overview of existing ocean science capabilities. And it examined a number of areas which are key to any type of oceanography, and in various categories, marine ecosystem functions and processes, as well as ocean health, were clearly identified as separate categories. So there's a whole wealth of information there about capabilities and obviously thus gaps. And you can download that report. I had some summaries, but only the non-English ones are left. And finally, the proposed, I should say, International Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So gearing up to 2030, we're proposing a follow-on to the, in the 1900s, but the 2021 to 2030 period, which has already been endorsed and is now at the UN General Assembly. The key objectives are to build inventories of marine resources and how to manage them. So, for example, marine spatial planning, better knowledge of ocean ecosystems, understanding the impacts of cumulative stressors on the ocean, so biodiversity, share knowledge of and develop capacity and transfer of marine technology. So there's a whole list of proposed outcomes. There's brochures over in the corner there in 3 languages. And the reason I say it's proposed is because, well, not only is it not finalized yet, but even hopefully it will be finalized by December. But what we really covet is your input. It's a chance for people to work together to really define what's going to come out of the ocean decade. Thank you.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left for questions for our panelists. Any questions? Yep, Mark.
Hey, for Pat and Ben, that notion of conserve 10%, was that quantified as a MPA no take, or is that just everything that can be a management unit and comprise of 10%? So how are they defining what will be the 10%?
Actually, that's a great question. I've raised that several times at several different UN meetings because I get some different responses depending who I ask. A lot of that, I think, was originally from an area perspective, but it should be better defined and more precisely defined. So I know exactly where you're going with that, and I fully agree.
We can reach 10% pretty easy if we make it very
And there's also been discrepancies in terms of the jurisdictional boundaries of whether or not the goals were across all the ocean basins or within EEZs. So there's many, many different, you ask different people and you're going to get very, very different responses of what that actually means.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks. A lot of very interesting presentations. Michael, this is for you. I'm Becky Schufert. I work with NOAA on ecosystem things, and that includes the Large Marine Ecosystem Program. So in terms of the regional, I think you'd said the regional alliance forum for the for the observing system. Some of the things that we've been talking to Gabrielle and Frank about are making better connections with the large marine ecosystem community. You touched on that, but obviously there have been some conversations with Julian and others, I assume,
Right.
related to connections there. So I'd just like to put that out there that maybe we link together on some of that conversation on how to do that and look to the future of those elements. I don't know if you're potentially going to be in Cape Town at the LME meeting.
Like I said, I'm not involved with this, so I hope I did
Okay.
I hope I did a good job of summarizing some of the.
Oh, it was fine. I'm
okay.
just trying to make appropriate
But I can
linkages where we
definitely
can.
put you in contact with the right people.
Well, I have a call with
Okay.
them on Thursday, but
good.
so I'm just saying with the folks that you're working with, making sure that we formalize that connection a little bit better, so we don't have 3 points of entry to the same thing.
Right.
Hi, Erin Hester. I'm the interim North American Regional Coordinator for the newly recognized Freshwater Bond, which is a new thematic bond around freshwater. I'm glad you brought up connectivity. I think there are natural connections between our two themes. And so I would like to put it out to the community, what can we do to work together, and what can the Freshwater Bond do to engage with you guys? Our immediate deliverables that we're working on right now, we have 135 members, and we anticipate having harmonized sampling protocols for macroinvertebrates and fish in the freshwater realm by the next year. And in the very, hopefully near term, in the next 3 to 5 years, we're looking at a global classification of freshwater systems, harmonized protocols for phytoplankton, zooplankton, periphyton, fungi, and ecoacoustics. And so those are kind of our immediate activities. We are new, and we're very interested in working with you.
Just maybe a quick response while we're moving the mic around. Or years ago, talking to people about how we have watersheds on land where we aggregate, land features where the water goes, but I think we should have land sheds in the ocean. Where does the terrestrial environment actually affect the coastal oceans?
Yeah, I think it's a real interest from an MBON perspective that we're looking at connectivity to across landscapes. So freshwater bond, geo-wetlands, and marine bond, I think could have an interesting conversation about common approaches, where they make sense, and sort of ways to, efficiencies and ways forward together. So I would welcome that.
Other comments or questions? Yep.
This is also some sort of comment. I'm Gonzalo Cid. I work for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and NOAA. All these efforts require funding. And there are very few, actually, funding agencies out there that can actually fund things at this scale. And sometimes the diversity or the no integration actually is also part of this lack of funding. Sometimes the funding is not integrated. So I think if we all are talking about decision making, data for decision making, I think one of the big messages, in my opinion, is how we get funding to integrate data. So I think we have a lot of sorts of efforts out there. Sometimes they are not connected, but I think the big message is for the donor agencies to precisely that the effort for integrating data.
You might want to tackle that, or
I definitely have some comments on that. Fully agree. It's a huge challenge to fund these efforts. It's extremely difficult to fund sustained efforts. So funding agencies tend to want to fund new projects, and one of the points I was trying to make is we should just build on the existing ones, and it's not as sexy. It's much harder sell to go to funding agencies and say, can you do the renewal on these projects that are ongoing? They need to be sustained, and that's just harder to sell. But the integration, the synthesis, I think we do need to show value, and I think there's easy ways to do that. But and it has to go beyond just the scientific merit. You need to be able to show that there's true societal values in what we're producing. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge because you're trying to build long-term structures and infrastructure and sustain it over time. So if you have a secret for that, let me know.
So we've been having a few discussions among the MBON group over the last year or two about the future of MBON and sustainability of funding there. And one of the points of discussion we've had is trying to come up with the right unifying theme that crosses a bunch of programs within NOAA that are doing really good work, but doing it somewhat independently of other programs. And pulling them all together under a unifying theme of some sort might help leverage more NOAA interest in continuing the MBON. There are other partners too we need to talk about, but I'm just talking about NOAA here. And the ecosystems theme seemed to be one of the places that they would pull a lot of things together within NOAA. People that are already working on ecosystem level approaches to, ensuring continuity and sustainability of ecosystems, not just fish stocks and not just sanctuaries or protected areas, but ecosystem conditions. So I don't know if a unifying theme would help us generate that kind of internal support and maybe cross-agency support too, but that's the kind of discussions we're trying to have that raise this to some other higher level. Biodiversity is a concept within that ecosystem issue or that discussion, but I think biodiversity on its own is not enough.
So from the Atlantis perspective, there are a number of work packages that are looking at how to integrate. And one of the things you need to do when you want to integrate at least the measuring of observations is to think about time scales, spatial scales. You have to get them on some sort of similar footing. And that's really one of the strengths of the framework in thinking about, essential variables and then defining timescales, et cetera, to be able to merge that. That's some work that's going on, but often you'll find that, from my limited knowledge, that you really get a lot of gain by focusing in on certain applications or regions where there's a real need. And so another work package in Atlantis is developing applications. And fisheries, the albacore tuna, for example, you need for modeling, you need certain different types of data that can be brought together in models. So once these applications are fostered and available, that's when you really see the value, because then you start to get people who are very interested in the results. And once you prove that value chain, that goes again to how you can keep the funding going. Because as you said, it's not just about the science, even though that's a key underpinning. You really have to meet the societal needs now. So.
Oh yeah, I just had a quick kind of comment or question for Pat and Michael. I really enjoyed hearing about the need for a change towards a three-dimensional paradigm and focus on marine spatial planning. But I would encourage us all to think about the additional dimension and that of time, and that the ocean is this fluid environment that moves, and ocean ecosystems move in space and time. So I'm wondering about, and we also talked a lot about partnerships with the marine ecology community, so I'm wondering how we could form more stronger partnerships with the oceanographic community. And for example, how can we build upon the existing biological or ecological observatories and integrate higher taxonomic resolution into ocean observatories that can handle the fluid dynamics?
First off, I completely agree, and actually this morning I was trying to cut out slides, and I took out the slides that said 4D. So exactly on that topic. I mean, it is a 4D world, and getting just the three-dimensional graphics, so we start actually paying attention to the mesopelagic zones is really important, but the dynamics are critical, and an average ocean doesn't move, and so completely agree, and it's another huge challenge to be able to bring along not just the scientific community, who I think are fairly comfortable with that, is to bring in the management and policy community that really will struggle with how do you deal with dynamics and how do you deal with boundaries that shift and move, and we deal with that a lot right now. With defining areas in the open ocean that are important areas, but the boundaries are totally fluid. And how do you describe those? Actually, describing them down to a legal sense. When are you in the Sargasso Sea or you're not in the Sargasso Sea? Things like that are questions that are coming up right now. And that's a big part of this. And the biological data actually is going to help answer that question, because a lot of the characteristics and features that we need to define for the lawyers are going to come from that. So it's making those connections that are going to be really important.
So there are, in a number of test cases, cabled observatories, and really proving their value despite the high cost. But with advances in technology, and as part of the proposed ocean decade, smart cables, et cetera, like that, are one area that's being looked into. So, we can do now somewhat, at least from a physical point of view, with HF radar, 4D for, well, I guess it's actually 3D because it's not depth, but of the ocean surface. But with cables, we can definitely go interior to the ocean, and there's no reason why, with some development, that biological instrumentation can't be added to these smart cables.
All right. Any last words before we close this? If not, thanks to our panel again, thanks to our other speakers, and thanks to everybody for coming out this afternoon. This has been a great session. Thank you all.